Thank you, and I'm pleased to be introduced by someone from the university. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to Mohammed and Osama and everyone who had a hand in organizing this very, very important. And I think, as far as I'm aware, at least on the East Coast of the USA, kind of unprecedented event. And I do hope that this is just the first of many, because these issues need to be aired. As Richard said, not because we're, at least certainly in my case, I'm not affiliated with any political party or political organization. I'm not here as a supporter of any political group. I'm here because of a really severe human rights crisis in Egypt. As Richard mentioned, I started with Human Rights Watch in 1996, and a lot of the work I've done with the organization since then has involved Egypt. I've made many, many visits to Egypt, worked on reports, many different aspects of the crisis there under Hosni Mubarak. I had the great fortune to have been in Cairo, in Egypt, during the January-February revolution in 2011. I saw that firsthand. It was an extraordinarily exhilarating time of my life, having been working on Egypt for all those years, and even before Human Rights Watch, to see that fantastic explosion of political energy and popular unity. It was extraordinary, and makes it all the more painful to see what has happened in Egypt, and among other things, the terrible polarization that we've seen in the country. And I have to say, the kinds of issues I've been dealing with, and I'll go into a little more detail in the couple of minutes I have, but the kind of issues that we're looking at, unlawful use of force, and I'm using kind of human rights lingo now, but because, what we do, we're not a conflict resolution organization, we're not even a pro-democracy organization, we're a human rights organization. So that means we look at the Universal Declaration, we look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. We look at the Convention Against Torture, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. These are sort of our documents that that's the law. These are the Convention Against Torture, for instance, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I have to remind people that, this was not written by Amnesty International. This was not written by Human Rights Watch. This was written by the international community, to use a phrase, by states, the member states of the United Nations. And it was these states, even if they didn't participate in the writing of these documents, but states like Egypt, for instance, who became states party to these treaties. These are treaties. These treaties represent international legal obligations for the states that sign up to them. And it's on that basis that we make our findings, and that's what we do. We don't rely on what we read in the press, thank God. We also, what we do is we're on the scene, or my colleagues are on the scene. And sometimes we're criticized for being perhaps a little slow off the mark when something very dramatic happens, an invasion, an occupation, this kind of thing. It sometimes takes us a few days or sometimes even a few months. But we don't go out there with our findings until we think we've got them right, and that usually takes some time. Let me just run quickly through what I see as the major issues here. I mentioned the unlawful use of force because that's what we saw in sort of legal terms, what underlies what many of you have called, and I think quite appropriately, a massacre in Rabaa. And of course, Rabaa was merely the worst in terms of numbers of fatalities, in terms of grievous harm to persons, was merely the worst in a whole series of which maybe you call lesser massacres that happened in the days, beginning in the days, the week, in fact, even the first week after June 30th, July 3rd. You know, let's assume, and again, just really I'm here to put a kind of a human rights analysis on these events. Let's assume that Rabaa, the demonstration, the sit-in there, I've been to the scene after the events. I've been there. I've seen the lay of the land. It's, you know, we're talking about enormous numbers of people in a kind of a major highway crossroads in a major part, Medina Nasser, a major part of Cairo. They were there. The people with the protesters were there for many, many weeks. It's largely, there are many government buildings, but it's largely a residential area. There are lots of apartment buildings and so forth. So yes, we know that residents were inconvenienced, to put it mildly. They were pissed, frankly. Many of them. They wanted that demonstration to end. There were many complaints put forward to the government. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that okay, there might have been a case that the government could have made for dispersing, and for that sit-in, which tied up a very considerable part of the city, for it to end. But how do you do that? Especially when you're going into that, now we're talking about early August, middle of August, when you've had these incidents, already 4 or 5 incidents, in which scores of people have been killed, precisely because of the kind of knee-jerk reaction of Egyptian security forces to use lethal force. Now, in human rights law, there are certain standards that have been developed. One of them is the UN Basic Principles on the Use of Force and Firearms by law enforcement officials. And here I'm going to quote very briefly from that document. In the dispersal of assemblies that are unlawful but nonviolent, law enforcement officials shall avoid the use of force, or, where it is not practical, shall restrict such force to the minimum extent necessary. So international law wouldn't rule out, de facto, absolutely, under no circumstances should live fire be used, but it sets down very strict conditions, very strict in which that live fire might be used, and if it's used, how it's to be used. And obviously we can see in a situation where when the smoke cleared and when the fires were put out, when we saw, by the government's own acknowledgement, well over 600 people, and we have good reason to think the toll was considerably high. The death toll from that one incident, that one day-long clash, was considerably higher than whatever, 638, I think was the number the Ministry of Health had put out, until they were told by the Ministry of Defense to stop counting, and certainly to stop publicizing what the death count was. Egypt has suffered from now paroxysms of violence. We've seen the death toll since July 3rd, has been, by some estimates, well over 3,200 people. Okay? Now, that includes a large number, like about 280, according to the government, security officials. But they weren't killed in Rabaa. They weren't killed in those clashes. They were killed in attacks. There is a terrorism problem. There's a serious terrorism problem that Egypt is confronting today, partly coming out of this polarization that I spoke of earlier. So, the authorities certainly do have a serious security issues, and Egyptians of every walk of life face serious security issues. But when you have this situation where after an attack on a police station, for instance, there have been a number of these in Cairo itself, never mind in Sinai, places far removed from Cairo, when minutes after the attack, you have the Minister of Interior saying it was the Muslim Brotherhood. Minutes after the attack. Obviously no investigation. Obviously no, and even today, now, many months after some of these attacks, not a shred of evidence has been produced linking these attacks to the Muslim Brotherhood. And that organization has, number one, that organization has denied those attacks. Number two, another organization, actually a couple of different organizations, but primarily one, Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, have claimed the attacks, okay? Just in the last 2 days, a Cairo court actually pronounced that Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, which operates mainly out of Sinai, as far as we understand, defined it as a terrorist organization. Now we know the government has labeled Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, again, without producing any kind of substantiation for that accusation. But no court, interestingly, as far as I'm aware, and I'm ready to be corrected, no court, as is required under Egyptian law for that designation to have the force of law, a court has to pronounce. It hasn't happened, actually, in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood. Not that that stopped the authorities from, the rather vicious and, in many respects, deadly campaign that they've launched. A couple of other issues. Obviously, the issue of torture is a major problem, continues to be a major problem. I should say that all of these violations, human rights violations, that I'm mentioning very quickly in a very cursory fashion this afternoon, there are violations that have occurred. They occurred under Mubarak on a large scale. They occurred under the SCAF, the Supreme Committee of the Armed Forces, that ran the country from February 2011 until Morsi took over as president in June 30th, 2012. And then under Morsi himself, these violations continue. Let me be quite candid about that. But we've seen the, spike is the word we sometimes use colloquially here to describe a phenomenon where you just see an incredible upsurge in these really serious violations, including torture, mentioning unlawful killings, sometimes amounting to executions. We're talking, if you want to talk about justice, we should talk about justice. We should talk about the problem of the inability of certainly people facing politicized charges or political charges in Egypt today to get a fair hearing. I mentioned the lack of any evidence to support the terrorist label that the government has put on the Brotherhood. But if any of you have been following the trial of the Al Jazeera English correspondents, but worth mentioning, there are these three correspondents, an Australian, an Egyptian Canadian, and an Egyptian. But then there's about 20 other people in that case who are all Egyptians. So the problem that's facing a couple of high-profile international journalists is facing many, many more Egyptian journalists, okay? And if you follow that particular trial, you see that hearing after hearing, and at least they've had hearings, which, as we know from listening to Sarah, not everybody has even had the judicial hearing, or actually faced charges. But the charges in the case of these, of what I'll call for shorthand, the Jazeera case, it's hearing after hearing, there's just no evidence produced. And these guys, and I think I'm correct in saying they're all guys, these guys have been in prison now for many, not as long as Khaled, to be sure, Khaled Kazaz, but have been in prison for many months now. Not allowed, the judge refuses to allow them out on bail. Again, completely, a complete miscarriage of, just a shocking lack of compliance with basic fair trial standards. The government itself, the Ministry of Interior people, told the Associated Press back in March, they 16 or 17,000 people were in Egypt, which is an enormous number. But we also know that's not the full count. We know on the basis of the good work that Egyptian human rights organizations have done. I mean, they've documented by name, age, where they were arrested, what they're allegedly, the charges they're facing, and so on. Well over 21,000. And those are the cases they've documented. So they know, and I think we can assume that, the actual number, we don't know it, frankly. We don't know it, but we know it's enormous. And then you have this travesty of a couple of weeks ago, where a court in Minya, in Upper Egypt, issued death sentences against 529 people after a hearing lasting approximately 1 hour. I didn't note down who this quote came. I mean, it's from a judicial official involved in the case. Here's what he said afterwards. He told the media: "We are in exceptional circumstances. We don't have time to summon each and every defendant, prove their presence, confirm who are their lawyers. Now no one would dare to think to attack a police station or a state institution after they saw the death penalties falling on their group's heads." End quote. The crime for which these 529 people were sentenced to death was an incident shortly after the Rabbah attacks, in which one policeman was killed. Now that's, a crime was committed there. Let's acknowledge a crime was committed there. Perpetrators should be held accountable, no question. But we do know, just common sense tells us that 529 people were not responsible for the death of this one policeman. I think in the interest of allowing things to, just let me mention a couple of other issues. I was very glad to see the poster up here about destruction of churches, because that's been, and again, reflecting the polarization I referred to earlier. There have been real serious problems of sectarian violence. Again, these go back many, many years, but again, we've seen a spike. And I have to say, this is an area where I think Muslim Brotherhood leaders have to take some responsibility themselves in terms of some of the things that were said from platforms at Rabbah and elsewhere that help contribute to this. This is, it certainly became another spike in these kinds of attacks after July 3rd, and then again after August 14th, the Rabbah massacre. Just one other thing. The first piece of major legislation under this sort of interim government of Ali Mansour, of course we know the power behind that particular throne, the former defense minister Sisi. The first major piece of legislation came down in late November, and it basically allows the Ministry of Interior to ban any meeting of a public nature, which involves 10 people or more, allows the forcible dispersal of such assemblies, protests, demonstrations, if even a single stone is thrown. In the words, to quote the law again, if any criminal act emanates from participants. So let's say you have a political demonstration, a protest demonstration, and one individual throws a rock against it. Not hard to imagine that happening. Let's acknowledge that. According to the letter of the law, this allows the authorities to wade right in with their batons, with their water cannons, or with their, with their rifles. What we saw, I think it was the 24th of November when it became law by decree. 2 days later, activists, not Islamists, not Muslim Brothers, activists who were people who were mobilizing for the January 25th revolution, held a demonstration, basically to test the law, frankly, held a demonstration, I forget, I think it might have been at the Supreme Court, I forget where they held it, but it was to protest military trials of civilians, bringing civilians before military courts. Again, a problem. It was under Mubarak, it was under the SCAF, it was under Morsi, and it's under the current government. And again, the police waded in, and that's where you saw the dragnet really extend well beyond Islamist offenders to include many of the secular/leftist activists who were so instrumental in mobilizing for the January-February 2011 revolution. Let me, that's good. I am just going to take that and perhaps a bit abruptly, but let me turn it over to turn it back to you to introduce things.
Okay. Thank you very much.